4 generations. History textbooks taught us that Britain and the United States were united allies, seamlessly fighting together to defeat the Axis powers, a heroic narrative of shared victory and democratic solidarity. But behind the triumphant headlines and the famous wartime speeches, a colder, more brutal war was taking place. A financial war fought not with bombs and tanks, but with ledgers, loans, and secret agreements. This conflict was waged in the quiet, mahogany-paneled offices of Washington, D.C., and its true purpose was the dismantling of the largest empire the world had ever known, the British Empire. This video is not about Churchill's courage, but about Britain's debt, a crushing financial weight engineered by their closest ally, a debt so enormous that its final payment was only made decades after the war ended, long after the empire itself had evaporated into history. The popular history says Britain won the war, but the economic reality is that Britain was the conflict's greatest financial casualty, a paradox we will fully explore today. At the start of the Second World War, the British Empire controlled vast swathes of global trade. Its financial system, the sterling area, dominated commerce from Australia to India, yet by 1941, the British treasury was virtually empty. The war machine devoured its gold reserves at an impossible rate, forcing Prime Minister Winston Churchill to write desperate letters to President Franklin D. Roosevelt begging for aid, but the aid offered was not charity, it was a contract of financial subservience. The agreement, known as the Lend-Lease Act, was presented as a generous solution to arm the Allies, but hidden deep within its clauses were the precise economic instruments that would allow the United States to systematically seize global financial supremacy and force the liquidation of British power. The $3.75 billion loan that followed Lend-Lease was not a bailout. It was an eviction notice disguised as a friendly hand, and if you stay until the end, you will understand why this comparison, the true cost of victory, was forbidden for decades, and who was the true winner of this financial war. Think about this chilling fact. Every piece of American equipment sent across the Atlantic, every Spitfire engine, every cargo of food, was legally subject to one catastrophic condition: either return the item after the war or pay for it. On September 2nd, 1945, just days after Japan formally surrendered, President Harry S. Truman, without warning or negotiation, signed the order for the immediate termination of the Lend-Lease program. This sudden, brutal cutoff plunged Britain, still scarred by bombing and exhausted by 6 years of war, into an instant, unprecedented financial panic. With the flow of vital American supplies halted, the nation faced immediate starvation and industrial collapse. They needed $5 billion overnight just to keep the lights on and the population fed. But Britain had no dollars left. They had spent everything defending the free world, only to find themselves facing a ruthless financial ultimatum from the same world they had just saved. This financial desperation forced the delegation, led by the legendary economist John Maynard Keynes, to fly to Washington, D.C. in a desperate attempt to secure a lifeline. But the American negotiators, led by Treasury Secretary Fred Vinson, did not treat them as heroic allies. They treated them as debtors with no leverage. The price of the massive 1945 Anglo-American loan agreement, the so-called lifeline of $3.75 billion, was not just the 2% interest rate and 50 years of repayment, which was crippling enough. The true cost lay in the conditions that forced Britain to dismantle its imperial trade barriers. The U.S. demanded that Britain essentially dissolve its sterling area trade preference system, opening up its vast global market, including its colonies and dominions, to unfettered competition from American goods. This was the moment the United States finally delivered the decisive financial blow, using the leverage of the war debt to ensure that the sun would not only set on the British Empire, but that American financial power would rise to take its place. If you find this hidden, cinematic truth about global power shifts compelling, please consider subscribing and liking this video. It helps us uncover more of the economic secrets that shaped the modern world. Keynes returned to London, physically exhausted and humiliated, knowing he had signed a pact that, while saving Britain from immediate collapse, had irrevocably surrendered its economic future to the United States. This loan was not a gesture of goodwill. It was the financial mechanism for an economic coup. And the single most damaging clause was the requirement that the British pound sterling be made fully convertible into US dollars within 1 year. The sterling area, the massive trading bloc where dozens of nations held their currency reserves in pounds, was Britain's last financial defense, a protection against dollar dominance. But the US demanded its removal, insisting on a single global trade system dominated by the dollar. The British government, desperate and having no choice, implemented the convertibility clause in July 1947, a decision that has gone down in history as one of the most disastrous financial blunders of the century. As soon as the pound became convertible, holders of sterling, especially nations in the former empire who needed dollars to buy American post-war products, rushed to convert their reserves, draining the remaining gold and dollar supplies from the Bank of England at an alarming, unsustainable rate. The run on the pound was so immediate and so severe that within just 6 weeks, the United Kingdom had burned through the majority of the US loan designed to last several years. They lost millions of dollars every single day, and the government was forced into a humiliating panic suspension of convertibility, effectively retracting the promise they had just made. This catastrophic failure sent an unmistakable message to the entire world. The pound sterling was finished as the global reserve currency, and the financial architecture of the British Empire was terminally broken. The US negotiators had anticipated this chaos. They understood that Britain's reserves were too fragile to withstand such an open competition, but they demanded it anyway, knowing that the resulting collapse would eliminate their only serious financial rival. And this moment of financial humiliation accelerated the geopolitical shift away from London. Every colony and dominion watching this spectacle realized that the British metropole could no longer afford to defend or sustain them. It was the final undeniable proof that the empire's purse was empty, and this financial weakness became the direct catalyst for the wave of decolonization that swept through the world in the 1950s and 60s. The debt imposed by the US was not just money owed. It dictated economic policy for the next 50 years. For instance, the US insisted that the UK could not discriminate against American films, a small clause with massive cultural and economic implications, ensuring that Hollywood would dominate British screens and cultural influence would flow from west to east, not the reverse. Every aspect of British recovery and trade was now subject to the oversight and ultimate approval of the American financial establishment, a quiet form of financial control far more absolute than any military occupation. To pay off the growing mountain of debt and meet the conditions of the loan, Britain was forced to make internal sacrifices that were devastating to its population. Rationing of food necessities continued long into the post-war period, well after rationing had ended in the United States, and the government was forced into years of deep austerity. One of the most tragic aspects of this financial dismantling was the forced liquidation of British foreign assets. Before the war, British investments abroad, especially in the US and Latin America, were vast. These are the financial reserves of the empire, providing a steady income stream in foreign currency. But to pay for the early stages of the war and to meet American demand for collateral, London was compelled to sell off these assets at fire sale prices. American bankers and investors were the main buyers, acquiring British ownership of railroads, companies, and property across the continent, thus transferring centuries of accumulated British wealth into American hands, all in the name of the war effort. This wasn't merely selling off silverware, it was selling off the empire's future income. And this action permanently weakened Britain's long-term balance of payments, ensuring that its dependence on external loans would only deepen. And this continuous drain of wealth, initiated by wartime necessity and accelerated by American loan demands, is the true meaning of the term economic suicide. This debt, this financial shackle, only truly ended in December 2006, when the UK made the final payment on the 1945 loans, a staggering 61 years after the war ended. But the cost was not merely the interest paid over those decades. The real price was the loss of an empire, the surrender of global financial leadership, and a multi-generational dependency on American financial goodwill, a relationship that fundamentally changed the trajectory of the 20th century. This history is not taught in depth because it shatters the myth of unconditional wartime alliance and reveals the ruthless pragmatism of American statecraft, where an economic opportunity was seized with cold precision, even at the expense of its greatest ally. This long-term debt proved that the financial weapon was the ultimate victor of the war. This initial deep dive has shown how the stage was set for Britain's long, slow decline, but we have only scratched the surface of the internal social consequences and the exact details of the final financial maneuvers. We now turn our focus to the specific economic mistakes made by Churchill's cabinet and how the conditions of the American loan directly fueled social unrest and the dismantling of the Raj. The catastrophic failure of the 1947 convertibility attempt was not an isolated incident. It was the direct, predictable result of a fundamental structural flaw in the British economy, a flaw that American negotiators ruthlessly exploited. And this flaw was the vast, unfunded mountain of sterling balances, liabilities owed by the United Kingdom to its colonies, dominions, and trading partners for goods and services supplied during the war. These balances represented deferred payment, essentially IOUs the British government had issued to India, Egypt, and others, promising payment in pounds sterling, but since those pounds were often restricted from being converted into dollars, they were essentially locked inside the sterling area. The total sum of these unfunded sterling balances was astronomical, approaching £3.5 billion, which adjusted for inflation would be hundreds of billions of dollars today, dwarfing Britain's remaining gold and dollar reserves. The U.S. Treasury knew that forcing the convertibility of the pound meant that these massive accumulated debts would suddenly seek conversion into hard dollars, creating an impossible demand on London's limited treasury. It was quite literally an instruction to open the floodgates when the dam was known to be weak. This calculated exposure served the American strategic goal perfectly. By causing the run on the pound, the U.S. not only demonstrated that the sterling area was unsustainable, but also solidified the dollar as the only viable international currency, ending any hope of the pound returning to its pre-war global dominance. The subsequent scramble for dollars forced every trading nation to adopt the new financial framework being built in Washington and Bretton Woods, where the dollar reigned supreme. The financial architects of the American victory did not need to fire a single shot to defeat the pound. They simply needed to expose the truth of the British financial position, forcing London into a humiliating retreat that confirmed their status as a secondary power. Winston Churchill, who had famously promised to never preside over the liquidation of the British Empire, was forced to watch this financial liquidation from the sidelines, knowing that the cost of fighting Hitler was the surrender of financial sovereignty to Roosevelt's successors. This period of financial shock therapy directly impacted the lives of ordinary British citizens, as the government, desperate to conserve every dollar, continued the severe rationing of necessities like sugar, meat, and gasoline well into the 1950s, a lingering economic shadow cast by the immense debt point. One of the most profound consequences of this debt burden was the forced abandonment of India, often called the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. While the political and social movements for independence were certainly powerful, the financial reality made it impossible for Britain to resist. India was Britain's single largest creditor in the sterling balances crisis, owed a staggering £1.2 billion for its massive contribution of resources and troops during the war. Britain simply could not afford to keep India, not because of military weakness, but because it could not afford to pay back the debt that India held. Maintaining control would require constant military spending and political investment, all while owing an impossible sum of money. Granting independence to India in 1947, simultaneously with the pound's convertibility crisis, allowed Britain to transfer the responsibility for settling some of these debts, or at least diffusing the immediate financial pressure, a desperate move to stabilize the collapsing financial structure back home. The independence of India was therefore not purely a political or moral decision. It was fundamentally a financial necessity dictated by the American loan conditions and the crisis of the sterling balances. This economic desperation led to hasty decisions and a chaotic withdrawal, contributing directly to the tragic violence of the partition, demonstrating the human cost of these high-level financial maneuvers. The American strategy extended far beyond India. It targeted every lucrative corner of the empire. The clauses in the loan that demanded the dismantling of imperial preference meant that suddenly, markets from Canada to South Africa were open to cheaper, mass-produced American goods. This was a direct assault on the traditional British manufacturing base, which was already struggling to retool from wartime production. The British government, now facing debt repayments and needing to earn dollars, was forced to export goods to the dollar zone, often at unfavorable rates, while simultaneously facing competition from those same American goods in their traditional imperial markets. This competitive pressure created a massive trade imbalance and contributed to the deindustrialization of Britain in the post-war era, a long, slow economic wound inflicted by a so-called ally. The economic reality for the average British worker was stark. While American workers were enjoying booming consumerism and rising wages, their British counterparts were asked to endure years of making do for the national good, their standard of living stagnating under the weight of the war debt. Another vital element of the American financial weaponry was the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944. While often portrayed as a collaborative attempt to stabilize the post-war world economy, it was in reality the establishment of a new global financial order entirely centered on the US dollar. The agreement pegged world currencies to the dollar, which was in turn pegged to gold at $35 per ounce, establishing the dollar as the world's reserve currency, essentially crowning the US as the new global financial hegemon. Keynes, representing Britain, fought bitterly against the American plan, proposing an international currency called the Bancor, which would have diffused global financial power, but the American delegation, led by Harry Dexter White, held all the cards because of Britain's desperate wartime need for financing. The Bretton Woods framework ensured that any financial stability in the post-war world would be built on American economic dominance, not shared with a weakened British Empire. This meant that every nation that needed dollars for trade or stability had to interact with the U.S. Federal Reserve, granting Washington unprecedented financial and political leverage globally. The British negotiators returned from Bretton Woods knowing they had lost the battle for the financial soul of the post-war world, forced to accept a system that guaranteed their long-term decline. The true cunning of the American strategy lay in its longevity. The debt repayment schedule was set to run until the year 2001, later extended, ensuring that successive generations of British politicians would be constrained by the financial decisions made in 1945. This long-term obligation severely limited the UK's ability to invest in social programs, infrastructure, or defense in the crucial post-war years, forcing continuous cuts and austerity measures. For example, when Britain attempted to maintain its global standing through military interventions, such as the Suez Crisis in 1956, the US was able to wield its financial power as a direct weapon. When the British pound came under pressure during the crisis, the US Treasury refused to provide financial support to shore up the currency unless Britain immediately withdrew its forces from Egypt. This swift and decisive financial blackmail demonstrated absolutely where the true power now lay, confirming that the UK could no longer act as an independent global military power without the express financial permission of Washington. Suez was the geopolitical death certificate of the empire, but the financial foundation of that defeat was laid in the loan agreements of 1945. But the sheer scale of the financial loss experienced by Britain during this period is staggering. Not just the debt owed, but the assets liquidated and the market share forfeited. This slow, methodical bleeding of wealth led to a deep-seated cynicism within the British political establishment about the true meaning of alliance, and the full extent of the financial damage was often concealed from the public. The austerity years of the 1950s were not simply an unfortunate post-war phenomenon. They were the direct, measurable interest payment on the cost of the loan and the structural requirements imposed by the U.S., a price paid by the working class in ration books and delayed infrastructure projects. This systematic financial subjugation by their ally ensured that Britain's recovery would be sluggish, difficult, and ultimately subordinate to American economic interests. The irony is that Britain won the war, but was condemned to spend the peace paying for it, while the U.S., which entered the war later, emerged financially stronger and completely dominant. The final payment on the main U.S. loan was made only in December 2006, a symbolic end to a financial saga that spanned the reigns of 3 monarchs and several generations, an enduring testament to the power of economic leverage over military might. This is a story about how loans, interest rates, and currency convertibility clauses proved to be more effective than armies in determining the course of global history. And we have now established the primary financial mechanism, the debt, and its immediate consequences on the pound and the empire's global markets. But the full picture requires examining the internal British political battle against these disastrous terms and the social resentment it generated. The political resistance to the American financial demands within Britain was fierce, but ultimately futile, creating a profound, lingering bitterness that poisoned this special relationship for decades, a conflict that pitted the fading imperial pride against the brutal necessity of survival. When John Maynard Keynes returned from Washington with a signed loan agreement in 1945, he faced a storm of criticism in Parliament, not just from the opposition, but from within his own ranks. Many saw the terms, particularly the requirement to dismantle imperial preference and make the pound convertible, as a national humiliation, a betrayal of everything the empire stood for. Lord Beaverbrook, a powerful press baron and former cabinet minister, publicly condemned the agreement as an act of economic servitude, arguing that Britain was sacrificing its future sovereignty for short-term relief, and his voice represented a significant portion of the elite who understood the long-term implications of allowing American financial penetration into their closed trade bloc. The debate was emotional, pitting the idealized notion of an independent global Britain against the cold, hard logic of a treasury that was literally out of money, forcing politicians to vote for their country's financial subordination in the name of feeding the population through the winter. This parliamentary struggle highlights the depth of the crisis, demonstrating that every leader understood the destructive nature of the deal, yet felt compelled to accept it, solidifying the idea that the U.S. had used the desperation of war as a blunt economic weapon against its primary ally. This forced economic compliance had devastating repercussions on Britain's internal social fabric, specifically on the post-war Labour government's ambitious plans to build a welfare state. The National Health Service, subsidized housing, and expanded education were all core promises of the Labour victory. But every shilling spent on social reform was a shilling that couldn't be used to service the massive American and Canadian loans or cover the sterling balances. The continuous drain of dollars from a 1947 convertibility crisis and the subsequent need for austerity meant that these social programs were constantly underfunded and struggled to meet demand, leading to perpetual strain and economic difficulty throughout the 1950s. This is the crucial link. The American debt requirements directly curtailed the size and scope of the British welfare state, forcing a choice between national solvency and social revolution. The U.S. financial apparatus, whether intentionally or not, put a strong deflationary and conservative pressure on British domestic policy, ensuring that the country remained focused on debt repayment rather than radical domestic change. This long shadow of debt affected everything from the quality of healthcare facilities to the speed of rebuilding bomb-damaged cities, proving that the financial war fought in Washington had a very real, tangible impact on the daily lives of ordinary British families who continued to endure shortages and poor housing conditions for years. Furthermore, the debt fundamentally altered Britain's relationship with its colonies and dominions, accelerating the pace of decolonization beyond political control. The primary financial benefit of empire had always been access to cheap raw materials and captive markets, but the American loan terms undermined both. With the requirement to open markets to U.S. goods, the economic incentive for maintaining vast, expensive colonies diminished significantly. Additionally, countries like Australia and New Zealand, major holders of those troublesome sterling balances, quickly realized that the pound was unstable and began shifting their trade and financial reserves toward the dollar. This financial defection was far more damaging than any nationalist uprising, signaling the end of the integrated imperial economy. The UK could no longer financially dominate its own sphere, and once the financial bonds loosened, the political bonds quickly unraveled. The decision to withdraw from its massive military bases east of Suez in the 1960s was a direct result of the continuous financial constraints imposed by the debt, an acceptance that Britain simply could no longer afford the military overhead required to sustain its global commitments. The empire's rapid dissolution was less a concession to idealism and more an acknowledgement of fiscal insolvency, a financial calculation ruthlessly enforced by the balance sheet that America demanded. The complexity deepens when examining the issue of strategic export controls embedded within the Lend-Lease framework. The United States did not just control what Britain imported during the war, it also heavily restricted what Britain was allowed to export post-war, particularly to dollar zones. This was done under the pretext of preventing the re-export of Lend-Lease materials. But the real effect was to cripple Britain's ability to rebuild its foreign exchange earnings. If Britain couldn't aggressively export, it couldn't earn the dollars necessary to pay off the American debt, trapping them in a cycle of dependency. Every attempt by British industry to regain its preeminence was hampered by these regulatory controls, which were often applied arbitrarily to favor American competitors. This wasn't accidental. It was a finely tuned strategy to ensure that Britain, once the workshop of the world, would not regain its competitive edge against the newly dominant American industrial machine. It was a clear example of using wartime cooperation to strategically disadvantage a long-term economic rival, a chilling illustration of realpolitik applied through financial regulation. The enduring symbol of this financial subjugation is the story of the final payment in 2006. While the payment of $83 million was relatively small in modern terms, its significance was immense, as it marked the end of the final tranche of the 1945 loan and its associated interest, a bill that had spanned 2 centuries and 7 decades. This payment was not just an accounting footnote. It was a powerful reminder of Britain's sustained economic trauma and a long memory of financial contracts. Imagine the citizens of a victorious nation still burdened by the financial agreements of a war fought by their grandparents, demonstrating how effectively the American financial agreement had leveraged the past to control the future. The sheer longevity of the debt, stretching into the age of the internet and global finance, underscores the magnitude of the 1945 mistake and the relentless, compounding power of interest and principal. The final check symbolically closed the book on the age of Imperial Britain, confirming that the largest empire in history had been ultimately defeated not by external invasion, but by an internal, unsustainable financial obligation imposed by its supposed friend. This is the truth often sanitized in history books, the brutal economic reality that lies beneath the heroic narrative. This debt also forced Britain into internal political maneuvers that further destabilized its economy, specifically the repeated devaluation of the pound. Following the 1947 crisis, the UK was compelled to devalue the pound significantly in 1949 and again later, dramatic steps taken to boost exports and attract dollar revenue, but which simultaneously lowered the standard of living for the British people and increased the internal cost of essential imported goods. Each devaluation was a public sign of financial distress, further eroding international confidence in the pound and confirming the global shift toward the dollar. The financial health of the nation was perpetually held hostage by the looming debt and the demands of the U.S. Treasury, ensuring that every financial decision made by London was viewed through the lens of Washington's expectations. This continuous financial monitoring was the quiet, effective form of control that replaced the old colonial administration. We have laid out the mechanisms of the financial coup and its political and social effects that we must now turn our attention to the specific individuals involved in this transaction. Those British officials who argued vehemently against the terms and the immediate financial aftermath that affected the common person, before concluding who truly won the peace. The greatest tragedy of the Anglo-American loan was not the money itself, but the immense psychological and political cost borne by the few. British negotiators, especially John Maynard Keynes, who was effectively sent to Washington to bargain for his nation's survival with absolutely no leverage. Keynes, suffering from a severe heart condition, argued passionately that the terms being imposed by the U.S. Treasury were not only ungenerous, but fundamentally unworkable, warning that the requirement for immediate sterling convertibility would lead to a financial collapse, a prediction that was realized with terrifying speed in 1947. He pleaded that Britain, having sacrificed its wealth and assets to fight fascism for the benefit of the entire free world, deserved a gift, a financial gesture of solidarity, not a punitive commercial loan designed to serve American economic expansion. However, the American delegation, driven by a deep-seated desire to dismantle the protectionist imperial trade system and secure global market access for their burgeoning industries, remained coldly pragmatic. They saw an opportunity to enforce a free trade world where only their economy had the strength to compete, and they seized it without hesitation. Keynes returned home defeated, facing the humiliation of selling his nation's soul, and died shortly thereafter. A figure widely believed to have been emotionally and physically broken by the burden of this negotiation. The human impact of this debt was most brutally felt in the prolonged era of austerity that defined post-war Britain, a stark and immediate consequence of the relentless need to conserve dollars for debt service and essential imports. While the U.S. entered a period of economic boom and consumer abundance, life in Britain remained defined by rationed books and severe shortages. Meat was rationed until 1954, and food rationing lasted longer in the UK than in any other country in Western Europe, a humiliating reminder of their precarious financial position. This wasn't because Britain was unproductive. It was because the nation had to prioritize exporting goods to dollar markets to earn the currency required to meet the American loan conditions, meaning that goods produced in Britain were often unavailable to British consumers. This financial austerity fueled deep social resentment, creating a collective memory of hardship that contrasted sharply with the propaganda of a victorious nation, directly demonstrating to the British public that the victory came with a crushing, ongoing price tag imposed by a rich ally. The debt was not an abstract number. It was the reason a child's sweets were still rationed a decade after the war ended. The debt also acted as the primary accelerant for the transfer of technological and military leadership from London to Washington. Prior to the war, Britain held significant leads in areas like jet propulsion, radar, and nuclear research, but the financial necessity of the war, coupled with Lend-Lease agreements, meant that Britain was forced to share much of this technological prowess with the United States in exchange for vital aid. The quid pro quo for the loan further ensured that the U.S. would emerge from the war with both the financial means and the technological blueprint to lead the next era of innovation, while Britain, shackled by debt and austerity, could no longer afford the research and development necessary to maintain its competitive edge. This is why the U.S. led the space race and the technological revolution of the 1950s and 60s, while Britain struggled to finance even its essential infrastructure. The debt didn't just buy America market access. It bought them technological superiority, permanently cementing the U.S. role as the world's sole superpower. The ultimate irony lies in the fact that the final payment in 2006, while a closing chapter, still carried the taint of financial servitude. The British Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, Gordon Brown, publicly acknowledged the payment, but the official narrative continued to downplay the immense long-term cost of the loan and the predatory nature of its conditions. Historians now widely agree that the loan was the singular most decisive factor in the rapid financial and political decline of the British Empire, eclipsing even military losses. It formalized Britain's transition from a global financial power to a debtor nation reliant on American markets and currency stability. The weaponization of the dollar was so effective that it achieved a centuries-old geopolitical goal for the U.S. without a declaration of war: the dismantling of the most powerful trade rival. The loan was not paid off with money earned from a booming empire, but through decades of internal sacrifice and the incremental sale of national assets, a perpetual state of financial triage. This long-term financial control ensured that even when Britain attempted to carve out an independent role, it was quickly brought to heel. The Suez Crisis was the clearest military example, but the constant pressure to maintain the pound's stability throughout the late 20th century, often requiring IMF bailouts orchestrated by U.S. influence, demonstrates the financial leash remained taut. Every time the pound faced a crisis, Washington's shadow loomed large, demanding policy changes that aligned with American interests, not necessarily British ones. The debt, therefore, was not merely a historical footnote. It was a structural weakness that the U.S. could activate at any time to ensure compliance. Transforming the once proud ally into a dependent client state, we have revealed how the debt started, how it created the sterling crisis, how it accelerated decolonization in India and elsewhere, and how it directly led to decades of austerity for the British people, demonstrating that the Second World War had two victors, one military and one financial, and those two entities were not the same. The financial truth is far more brutal than the simplified tale of wartime heroism, exposing a cold calculation that prioritized national economic gain over Allied solidarity. This is the financial history that lies beneath the official version, a secret transaction that forever altered the global balance of power, transferring the world's financial center of gravity from the Bank of England to the Federal Reserve. The true winner of the Second World War was the nation that ended the conflict with the largest gold reserves and the power to dictate the terms of peace to its allies. The financial details of this story are now fully revealed, but the final judgment rests with you. What do you think? Was the fall of the empire really due to military defeat, or was the financial truth hidden on purpose to protect the reputation of those in power? Comment below and share your thoughts on the most significant financial betrayal of the 20th century.